Political chaos in Ottawa couldn't have come at a more challenging time. The government is bracing for U.S. President-elect Donald Trump's return to office, with his threats of massive tariffs and jabs at making Canada the 51st state by annexing this country using, quote, economic force. What started as social media taunts and trolling between Donald Trump, the Liberal Party, and Justin Trudeau now seems to be taking on more prominence and escalating.
Canada and the United States, that would really be something. You get rid of that artificially drawn line, and you take a look at what that looks like.
That's not going to happen. Canadians are incredibly proud of being Canadian. One of the ways we define ourselves most easily is, well, we're not American.
What's behind it all, and how should Canada deal with it? Joining us now is David Frum, staff writer at The Atlantic. Great to see you, David. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
When you hear this rhetoric from Donald Trump that started online as a meme and now it seems to be becoming an official policy that he's trying to push, or at least convince people that he's trying to push, do you think that he's serious about annexing Canada?
If you're living with a mentally unstable partner and he says, I'm going to push you down the stairs, he may not literally mean to push you down the stairs. If he then adds, I'm going to chop you up with a knife, he may not literally mean to chop you up with a knife. But you'd better have a plan, because he is going to do something. There's something dangerous brewing, and you need to pay attention to it. So I don't think Donald Trump intends to make Canada a 51st or 51 through 55 state. For one thing, he doesn't want to give Canada all those senators. But does he mean some plan of aggression and hostility to Canada? He pretty obviously does. And is it an important part of what's going on inside his brain? It is, because he keeps averting to it. I mean, he often will have some stray, sparkly thought in his mind. But this one he's come back to again and again, at the same time as he's been talking about territorial aggression against Denmark, a NATO member, territorial aggression against Panama, a longtime U.S. ally, and at the same time as he has had a campaign where he's talked a lot about firing weapons into Mexico to blow up fentanyl labs. So there's a plan of aggression against neighbors and allies in his mind, at the same time as he's planning to abandon Ukraine, and Canada better take that very seriously.
What do you think is driving this almost imperialistic drive that he's talking about? I mean, America's been an empire for a long time. It's big, it's very militarily powerful, but we haven't seen a president threatening NATO allies to take things against their will.
I don't want to quibble with your language here, but I would reject the idea that America has been, at least since 1945, anything like an empire. Americans came out of the Second World War experience realizing the key to their security was working collectively with allies. The allies were a multiplier. America led an alliance of the richest and most technologically advanced countries in the world, and its two most dangerous enemies ever, Germany and Japan, it recruited, and they became allies too. And the United States was able, with remarkably little military force compared to how much it was doing, to create a system on the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans of peace and trade that protected American interests at comparatively low cost. But it always depended on cooperation and taking the interests of allies seriously. Donald Trump has completely rejected that idea. He's never believed in it. He doesn't believe in collective security. He believes in domination and being dominated. And he wants the United States to dominate, because that's the only relationship he can understand. If you're not dominating, you're being dominated. One of the reasons he identifies so much with America's dictatorial enemies is because they do politics in a way that he understands. Putin isn't the servant of the Russian people. He's the boss of the Russian people. And Donald Trump doesn't like being the servant of the American people. He wants to be the boss of the American people, and through them, of everybody else.
What sort of scenarios do you think Canadians should be bracing for?
Canadians should be braced for a lot of tariff aggression. Although a tariff is a tax, unlike taxes, the president of the United States has a lot of unilateral authority to impose tariffs. And Trump seems to have a very rapid series of tariff increases coming. He has them planned. Members of his team may try to dissuade him from doing all of them, but he certainly seems to have them very much in mind. So get ready for that. I think Canada should be ready for, I don't think there will be direct aggression against Canada, but Canada should be ready for a lot of aggression against Latin American partners, and particularly against Mexico. Trump believes that the reason America has a drug problem is because bad Mexicans make good Americans take drugs. And the bad Mexicans can be defeated by armed force. And that's not only his idea, but that of his much more intellectually ambitious vice president, who's spoken about the same thing. And they have talked a lot about using military force as a way to stop the flow of drugs from Mexico into the United States.
And of course, that flow of drugs and people has been something he's identified with Canada too. Of course, it's much less so here, but some particularly high-profile terrorism cases in Canada that resulted in people coming here who plan to cross the border and terrorize the U.S. Have really been talked about by his team. We were both around after 9/11. The fear was always that Canada would be identified as somewhere terrorists were coming from, and that was falsely claimed after 9/11. And now you have an administration moving forward with some actual examples. They're also frustrated with how much they've had to spend to protect Canada while Canada has not invested in our military. Do you think there's a risk to Canadian sovereignty there, not in terms of the U.S. invading, but in terms of them deciding to make the decisions about our defense instead of consulting through things like NORAD and NATO about how we use our options together?
Canada has underinvested in defense, and it's underinvested in policing. When the government of India carried out an assassination on Canadian soil, the reason Canada could be so confident about that it was an Indian action was not because of anything Canada found out, but because of intelligence shared by Canada's partners, and especially the United States. So Canada should be less of a free rider. It should have more of a defense option. It should have more of a police capability. And so its voice will carry louder. And so its sovereignty will be protected and not invaded by allies who find Canada negligent. All of that said, the immigration threat that now looms in North America is of people moving from the United States to Canada. Trump is planning some kind of big immigration crackdown. Not clear how big. But you need to think about this not from the point of view of what will the Americans do, but what would a person who's at risk of being deported, what would that person think? And they would look north at Canada and see, here's a much laxer immigration regime. If you can get yourself to the border and then walk across, you can have the benefit of Canada's more permissive rules. And so there could be many thousands or tens of thousands or conceivably hundreds of thousands of people who fear deportation from the United States and try to find refuge in Canada.
Justin Trudeau, of course, will be stepping down as Prime Minister March 9th when the Liberals choose a new leader, but he stays on for now, and he said a big part of that is to be able to focus with Donald Trump. He was in Washington, D.C. on Thursday. He did not meet with Trump. Do you think that he's the right person to continue doing this, and it makes sense to have the Prime Minister go forward who maybe doesn't have anything to lose? Do you think he's doing a good job, and what does he need to do?
I think Justin Trudeau generally did quite a good job of managing Trump 1. And he and his government managed Trump 1 with a very familiar Canadian playbook, which is a combination of making some concessions to American demands while also mobilizing friends and allies, especially at the state level, to constrain the president from doing anything too crazy. And that more or less worked. USMCA is not as good an agreement for North American free trade as the old NAFTA was, but it's a lot better than nothing, and nothing was a threat. I don't know that in Trump 2 that playbook is going to work again, because in Trump 1, messing up North America was not a high priority for Trump, whereas in Trump 2, it really is. So Justin Trudeau will try the familiar playbook of concession and mobilizing friends. It's worth a try. It might as well have the outgoing lame duck prime minister do it, because if it fails, the failure can be marked to his demerit. But Canada may need a very different approach, recognizing a much more settled animosity on the part of the President of the United States and the people around him.
What would that approach look like if you were to advise the Prime Minister or Pierre Poilievre, who may be the next Prime Minister of Canada?
Well, my core advice is you need to get a dozen very experienced Ottawa and provincial civil servants and national security people in a room and say, there are no limits here. I want to hear your ideas, however crazy. Really run a red team exercise of crazy ideas. And it's probably not a good idea to talk about on television about what those ideas might be, because most of them will be pretty bad, and all of them will have self-harming consequences for Canada. But my general suggestion is, look, there was a Twitter thread by Aaron O'Toole, that the former leader of the Conservative Party, that did a great job of specifying the traditional way of conciliation, concession, working with partners. And that's plan A. But you really need to have a plan B of much more radical ideas that say, you know what, this president may not be interested in conciliation, and may not be someone who can be mollified by concessions.
David Frum, thank you so much for joining us today. An unparalleled and unprecedented time for Canada in dealing with a very different America potentially going forward, an American president. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.